Okay. It's our money, and we need our bank for our prosperity. Welcome, Vancouver League members and people who have joined this session through the library. And thanks for having us. You'll find in the chat a list of resources for further investigation of this subject if you feel like engaging in that. And you'll also find our contact information. Please get in touch if you have questions after we've finished this evening. So there. My name is Stony Bird. I'm the chair of the League of Women Voters of Washington Public Bank Advocacy Committee. In my previous life, I was a corporate lawyer for many years. I stopped doing that in 1990, and since then have been involved in various kinds of political activity. I got involved in public banking in a serious way while the League of Women Voters of Washington had a task force studying the question of whether the League could undertake advocacy for the formation of a public bank. They concluded that they could under the League's privatization position, which we'll get into in a moment. And then this advocacy committee came into being in August of 2020. And at first, Ruth, who is about to introduce herself, was the co-chair, but she demoted herself. So Ruth.
Thank you. Yeah, I just I found that I had a hard time dealing with legislators face to face. So I thought I would back off a little bit. Before public banking took possession of my life, I was a NASA geologist at the Johnson Space Center in Houston, an environmental geologist at the Hanford site in Eastern Washington. And then I decided after those two experiences that education needed to be much more integrated and holistic than it is. And I went back for PhD in education at the University of Washington and did that for unfortunately the PhD and my teaching career were kind of short. I did teach some courses, including one at Bellevue College in sustainable business practices, which was a lot of fun. And unfortunately, they shut that program down, or I would still be teaching it. In any event, the 2008 subprime scandal, which was, except for the Great Depression, larger in scope than anything before it, combined with its ominous lack of accountability, concerned citizens like me in Washington State. And we formed a very informal group and worked with then Representative Bob Hasegawa to introduce legislation for a public bank. After studying the matter, we realized that that was probably the best way to protect our money from having to bail out the Wall Street banks. And so for 8 or 9 years, he submitted his bill and it didn't get very far. And then more recently, last year, Senator Patty Creever took up the torch along with more legislators, including Senator Bob Hasegawa, and so introduced another bill for a public bank, SB Senate Bill number 5188. Unfortunately, it got amended to the point where at the end of the session, we didn't know what kind of, what we had in the bill, what was going to be created from it. In any event, it passed both houses, but never made it to the House floor for a vote. So it's going to be reintroduced this session and has already been introduced. So that's where we are there. So we're not used to, this is a quote from one of our, actually she's the chair of the revenue issue, including ours, and Cynthia Stewart. And she, this is what she said, pointed out, that we're not used to thinking of banking as a public sector function, but few things could be more critical to the well-being of the public than management of public funds.
And there's a very significant point in the title of this slide too, namely that the money system is part of our public economic infrastructure, a crucial part. And so it's a public good. And that was one of the reasons that the League decided that it could undertake advocacy for a public bank under the privatization position that the League adopted. It did that in 2011. This is the League of Women Voters of Washington, following the 2008 crisis. And what the privatization position says, does the proposed privatization proposed of an activity serve the public interest? Well, in the case of a public bank, the profits of managing the public's money, which a public bank could do, would be returned to the public, whereas, as we'll see, the profits of handling our money now zoop off somewhere else. Another crucial point about a public bank is that it can engage in projects that serve the public interest, even if they don't make the maximum possible return. And that also is something that a private sector bank could not do. Because of their obligations to their shareholders, they have to maximize their profits, no matter what, even when doing so is not in the public interest. And then there are these three overarching principles. Is the thing being privatized, would the thing being privatized be amenable to adequate oversight? Would its operations be transparent? And would the people conducting the thing being privatized be accountable? Well, the League thought that on all those counts, a public bank would be superior to what we see in the private sector.
So this I made a little more complicated because I wanted to make a few points here. And the boxes up at the top basically point out that private banks are in the business of private gain, and they do that by maximizing their fees and interest rates, and they minimize their costs, which includes the number of workers and how much they pay their workers. So their business model, and required apparently by law, is to do those things, which has no consideration for whether they're investing in fossil fuels or, gun manufacturing, private prisons, or the rather erratic stock market. Whatever makes them the most return is where they will go, because that's what they're supposed to do in our system. And so this turns out to be not having very many good outcomes for most of us. And so the idea of a public bank, as Stoney pointed out, it should be considered and is part of our public infrastructure. And if you had a public bank, it would be it would optimize profits for public needs, So the goal would be to help support the public goods and services that a government provides for us. Streets, roads, courts, that sort of thing. And its functioning would be efficient and cost effective compared to private banks, because you're cutting out the middlemen and all their fees and costs. And then the profits are returned to revenues. So you're actually increasing your revenues in the same way, because those are the public bank's profits, in the same way that the private banks make profits, but those profits go to the shareholders and the executives of the bank, very often in Wall Street, or at least out of state. The headquarters are not in state. So the other thing that the public bank would do would be able to invest in the green economy, affordable housing. Lord knows we need to figure out our housing, because Seattle now looks like India, with poverty camped right next to high rises in downtown Seattle. And it's a little disturbing, and it doesn't have to be that way. Of course, more community focused and small to medium sized business focused. So the Boeings and the Microsofts, they're doing just fine, and they have their tax breaks and everything in line. It's really the smaller businesses, and they were the ones that were hurt the most by the pandemic, for example. So those are the two sides of banking. And we are promoting a public bank because we want to have at least one bank in our state that works based on our values. So next slide, please.
So this displays the cycle that Ruth was just talking about. Let's start with the taxes. We pay our taxes, they go to the state treasurer. He puts them directly into private banks, and then the private banks profit in two ways. On the basis of having our money in their hands, they can increase the amount of lending they do overall and lend it anywhere in the world. And from that, based on that lending, they earn fees and interest, and that goes zooping off to their shareholders and CEOs. They can also lend to our local state governments, and they profit from that. And again, the fees and interest go off to their shareholders. The money continues around by virtue of investing in local affairs. It improves the local economies. We pay taxes and treasurers. But every time the money goes around the circle, they take out their bit. Whereas if we had a public bank, you'd have a circle again. But when the public bank, first of all, the public bank would invest only in local projects, and would often partner with local banks so that the local banks would be profitable. We'll talk about North Dakota frequently in this talk, but there are more banks per person and these are local banks in North Dakota than anywhere else in the country, because the North Dakota State Bank partners with them, supports them. And every time the money goes around this circle, the public bank profits, but where do its profits go? Partly into more investment in local projects, partly into the public treasury. And we'll get into who's which part of the public that will be in a moment.
So just a little more information about why a public bank for revenues is a better way to go, is because you gain efficiency when you don't have redundancy in the system. And basically what the treasurer's office does and the personnel there, they're managing this middleman. This it's actually one bank that is sort of the master deposit bank for all of the revenues, and then those revenues are distributed to local community banks and branches of big banks and credit unions around the state to then provide the banking and physical services for the districts, the school districts, the municipalities, and the work of business. So basically, they're an extra layer that doesn't have to be there because the treasurer already does. It has to manage this work. So why couldn't they just administer it themselves? And and they could. And if they did, then that would replace. We'd be replacing private banks, and we're really talking about the main private bank that all of those fees and the higher interest rates they charge because they want to maximize their profits would go away. And okay, so that's one thing. The other thing is by having our money in their private banks enables them to make loans because they have more reserves thanks to public money, but they're making loans to private groups and charging interest and making profit off of the very fact that they're holding our money, where we could be doing the same thing. We could be holding all of our money, and then we could be making loans based on the reserves, what it would be the equivalent of the reserves. So just what the private banks are doing, except we'd be making the profit on the interest. And the other thing, of course, is a single bank with one location and a much smaller number of people operating it results in very low operating costs compared to the big private banks. 50%, they don't even reach 50%, as low as 50% for operating costs for the big banks. Whereas like the Bank of North Dakota, you know, their operating costs are often less than 20% most of the time. So a public bank is able to be both more efficient and more cost effective, and not only make profits that right now we allow the private banks to make off of public money, but then, you know, that would be more money in our coffers, again, without raising any taxes or other revenue sources. Next slide, please. No, this is real.
So Ruth mentioned a bit of the history of public bank legislation in Washington State. Senator Hasegawa had submitted bills beginning in 2010, year after year. And then Senator Kuderer took up the chase last year. And last year, the bill really zoomed along until it got to the floor of the House, and they just ran out of time. And some of the features of the bill last year were that it would set up a cooperative bank owned by the state and such local and tribal governments as chose to join as members of the cooperative. One of the features of the bank that we weren't so very sure about was that loans that the bank could loan to non-members. So a county or a city or a school district could decide not to put in a capital contribution, but still get the benefit of the bank's low-cost loans. The bank would come into existence, according to the Senate's budget proposal last year, once the state had put in $200 million as a capital contribution, and at least 20 local and tribal governments had contributed a minimum collective amount of 50 million. So the bank would have started business with a capital of 250 million. And that would have made possible lending of up to 2 billion because of the magical fractional reserve lending that banks can do. And after that, the bank would be self-financing. The state, neither the state nor the original local and tribal member governments would have to put up additional funding. It would finance itself through the issuance of bonds on the financial markets and from its the profits on its lending business. And as we've said before, the profits on its lending business would presumably be kept in the bank, at least in part, to increase its lending capacity, but also distributed to the members of the bank, namely the state government and the local and tribal governments that had joined up. Oh, this thing isn't going, so I'm going to try this. Oh, wait a minute, now it's going, but it's going too fast. Okay, not quite there. Okay, so here's public banking in a nutshell. It's a bank owned by government entities. It could be the federal government, it could be the state government, it could be local governments, or it could be a combination of those. It multiplies its own funding capacity because it's a bank and it can engage in fractional reserve lending. The profits get returned to the public treasury. As Ruth pointed out, it's more cost effective and efficient because it has a lower cost structure, much lower than the private sector banks because it doesn't have a bunch of branch offices. And it can, another big distinction from private sector banks is that it can engage in projects that are simply because they're in the public interest and without necessarily earning the maximum possible return. At the same time, its operations would be more transparent, the public would be able to exercise better oversight, and the people in charge would be more accountable to the public.
So one of the things we struggled with last year was the language in SB 5188. It started out being a depository bank. Those were the words that were used. And it was also structured as a cooperative financial institution. And at the end of the session, it had been amended so that it appears that it was neither a depository and it was not to be called a bank. And so we're still seeking clarification on what the bill actually establishes in its last amended form. And when we say, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Velveteen Rabbit, but it's a wonderful children's story. Actually, it was written by a woman who had lost one person to World War I and a child to the Spanish flu in the same time period. And it's a story about a little boy who has this stuffed rabbit that he loves very much, and then he gets sick, and the stuffed rabbit meanwhile has noticed there were bunnies outside that could actually jump and run and do things like that, and he always wanted to be real. And in the end, of course, he became a real bunny. So I'm sorry, spoiler alert, I told you the ending. But what I mean here by using that image is that we want a real depository bank so that we can do that magic trick that Stoney mentioned of multiplying according to the Federal Reserve process of doing loans, where you reserve 10% of each loan, and then of that loan you can loan out 10%. I mean, you reserve 10 and then loan out the remaining part. You can do that like up to 10 times, so that when you start with $250 million, then you can actually imagine that turning into $2 billion. That's the kind of power that banks have. That's why banks have so much money, is that is one of the reasons. And so a bank is not a revolving loan center. It's not a clearinghouse. It is not a conduit for other, for money from the government to be handed to some other group to supply a mortgage. And so that's a tricky part. And we were not sure whether the language in the bill last year created a real bank or one of these other type of entities. It's a little frustrating to not be able to get a simple answer, but that's why I retired from being a more public person in this process. Sometimes I let my frustration show. Next slide, please.
Okay, before I get into this question, I want to finish a little bit the story of where the legislation presently is. As you saw in the slide, couple of slides ago, it got to the floor of the House last year. Where it's sitting right now is on the floor of the Senate, which was the House of Origin, and the sponsor of the bill, Senator Kuderer, is negotiating with her counterparts on the floor of the House. The idea is that once they've reached agreement on what the bill, how the bill would be amended once it gets to the House, Senator Kuderer will arrange to have it passed on the floor of the Senate, and it'll zip over to the House and go through the process there, all in accordance with something that's previously agreed. And our committee thinks that it is, in the abstract, a very good plan, but we don't know what what the provisions of the bill that they will agree on are. So we're waiting to find out before we express our support with the bill this year or not. Oh, Ruth, you're up here.
Okay. I'm in the process also of well, I'll get to that. So we're widening our circle of allies, and because we feel that community banks and credit unions would be in favor of a public bank if they understood it, not necessarily the big banks, not the Bank of America or Wells Fargo, because they deal at a much higher level. They, the big banks, they have 500 billion to 2 and 3 and 4 trillion dollars worth of assets. So we distinguish in our, trying to establish a public bank, working with community banks as a benefit both for the state and for the private banks in our state, but not necessarily the banks on Wall Street who are prone to make, just not play by the rules very well. And so there's certain groups that are already, understand what it would mean for them. Certainly educators do, the Association of Washington Cities, and one Republican, at least one Republican, Rob Chase, he comes out of Spokane. The irony of this is that a public bank really benefits everyone. It doesn't matter if you're a Republican or a Democrat or a Libertarian. It doesn't matter if you're wealthy or just the rest of us, like the rest of us. we would all benefit because money would be available to do infrastructure that we all need. Very few people are rich enough like Bill Gates. Unfortunately, we have a lot of them here. I think like 14 billionaires in the state of Washington who are rich enough that they can really do anything they want and they can supply themselves with anything that they want. But the rest of us really have to depend on public services for clean water and a safe environment and enough homes and food so that no one in this, in our state has to suffer the humiliation of not having enough to eat or a safe place to live. That's just not acceptable. And of course, obscene in my perspective. So I can't use strong words like that in other venues, but I'm hoping it would be okay here. So the next slide, please.
So here's a map of what's going on around the United States. The dark green is North Dakota, which has had for 100 years, and where the public bank has been serving the public interest all that time. Maybe the most immediate example is what they did after the 2008 crisis, where they kept lending in the middle of the crisis, whereas the private sector banks around the country just froze up, worsening the problem. The private sector banks were pursuing the interests of their shareholders as they're required to do, but over the collective effect was to worsen the problem. Because the Bank of North Dakota kept lending, there were fewer foreclosures, fewer bankruptcies, and lower unemployment in North Dakota than anywhere else in the country. And we could use that kind of help here in Washington when there's a bit an economic downturn. The orange states are ones on this map are ones where there is a bill actively under consideration in the legislature. And then the light green states are ones where there's a campaign in the public to set up a public bank. And you can see a few orange stars around. These are places where cities are have active legislation in their city councils aimed at setting up public banks.
Okay, so this shows basically federal legislation, and the one of most interest, and which a bill in support of has been submitted to our state legislature, is 4 different ideas to establish banks at different levels, but at the federal level. The one I've highlighted under the House of Representatives is the one that is most aligned with our bank bill, because ours is intended to be an infrastructure bank. And so HR 3339 is an Infrastructure Bank Act that was submitted in 2021. And we'll be entering information about that. They are having a teach-in tomorrow at, I'm not sure what time it is. I think it might be 2 o'clock, or it might be 11. Anyway, I'll put it in the notes. And it's worthwhile. The teach-in tomorrow would help you understand what we're trying to do on the state level, because it's really the same ideas, same concepts. And I think that one leverages the other. They're both really excellent things to have. And but that's the people promoting that are some of them are engineers who want to build a high-speed modern train, like 21st century train along the West Coast to really connect the Northwest. And so there's some very exciting projects that people would like to be able to afford and move on, as well as reinforcing the infrastructure we have now in preparation for the shocks that we're going to have from environmental problems, from the warming up and destabilization of our climate, as well as just taking care of the infrastructure that we have. Keeping it up, like the West Seattle Bridge, which wasn't being maintained and had some dangerous cracks in it. And we really don't want disasters like what happened in Minneapolis, Minnesota, if we can avoid them, and we should be able to avoid them. And then the Senate has the Banking for All Act, and then the Postal Banking Act. And these are all excellent ideas, as well as legislation. And the only reason not to support them is because you don't understand it, or you're ideologically and not thoughtfully opposed to it, but you're ideologically opposed to it. So I'll continue to put in the rest of the information about the National Infrastructure Bank. Next slide.
So to put this, we've been talking about the legislation at the state level and the federal level. To put it in context, if you look at public banking around the world, find is that 40% everywhere else in the world, people understand that there has to be a role for banks that serve the public interest. And one of the things I've read about banking in China is that it's because of their public banks that they've had the huge economic surge that they've had over the last several decades, because and then if the startup business misses a few payments, the Chinese banks say, look, they're getting this business going, and our lending to them has made that possible, and getting our money back really isn't the point. Think of that as a way to conduct a banking business, and as a result, Chinese businesses have just surged. If you are inclined, a few things that you can do. You can go to the state legislative website, and Ruth has put the link to do that in the chat. And you can go to the page for Senate Bill 5188 and just click a button that says support. And that then your views will be made known to your 3 state legislators, your state senator and the 2 representatives. You can also click a button that says you want to know what happens to SB 5188 as it gets processed through the legislature. And then every time something happens, every time there's a vote, every time there's a committee hearing, you'll get notification in advance. If you're not already signed up for the League's legislative newsletter, I strongly recommend that, and we will put action alerts in it and current information about SB 5188 as soon as there is some. As I say, there hasn't been yet this year. You can join the Friends of Public Banking. This is a website maintained by the Public Banking Institute. Some of you may know about Ellen Brown. She's written several books about public banking. And in fact, Ruth mentioned Representative Rob Chase from Spokane. We had a Zoom talk with him at one point last summer, and he held up one of Ellen Brown's books as his Bible on how to have a public bank. But this Friends of Public Banking is just a list of individuals and organizations that support the idea of having public banks around the country. If you are a member of a civic, a Rotary Club or a Kiwanis or a book club or any kind of a group, and you think they might be interested in having us talk to them about public banking, see if you could arrange that. That would be a great thing to do. And where I live in Bellingham, the city council has passed a resolution. It did it just in February of 2020, urging the legislature to pass legislation for a public bank. And any local councils that do that will give weight to the movement to have public banking in Washington state. And then you can go to the national legislative website for supporters of the National Infrastructure Bank that Ruth mentioned. You can join, there's a group called the Coalition for the National Infrastructure Bank, the NIB. You can join that. And then there's the teach-in that Ruth mentioned tomorrow evening. I think it's in the evening. With that, I think we're open for questions. And with my screen shared, I can't see whether there's anything in the chat or not. So I'm going to stop sharing and see what we see in the chat, if I can figure out how to do that. Oh, I've got to stop sharing. That's what I've got to do. There. Now I can see.
I've been
So there's one question here.
Yeah, and I've been putting in more links. Redundancy. There's a lot of redundancy.
Okay, so I'm going to go back to the top of the chat and see what I see. Oh, it's all your.
A lot of it's fine.
Oh no, there's some. Oh, I see. Well, let's take the ones in the chat and then we'll go on to. Okay, so there was a question, 50% of what, and it related to fences of private sector banks, and Ruth answered it in the chat saying it's 50% of the bank's revenues.
Go to overhead.
And the figure that I've seen for the Bank of North Dakota is 10% of the bank's revenues. So it's got a lot more to play with than the private sector banks do, or a higher percentage. The absolute dollar amount is not higher than JP Morgan Chase, let's say.
And Doug Lasher, you've asked about the arguments that will persuade legislators when the financial institutions are very influential in Olympia. Well, of course, that's the key question. There's a lot of education to be done, but if someone is ideologically set against the government doing anything like this, I don't think you're going to be able to persuade those people. You just have to persuade enough of the people that are open to having more ability to spend on projects that we need. And besides, I mean, so it's like the people that won't wear masks, you're not going to change them. So there's some people you just have to say, okay, we won't get these people. But I believe that it is possible to give enough examples of how the more affluent communities would benefit. That is not just all about, oh, it's more money for the poor people or this sort of thing. I think that we really have to reach across the aisle and find the people that actually want to do the right thing for our state and country. And it's not all about, and aren't just totally, rolling up their eyes with dollar signs in them, that they just are persuaded that government has no role, even though if the government doesn't have a role, we're all doomed, because we have come off of 40 years of this privatization, and it's not looking good for the majority of people in this state or in this country. And so I'm hoping that, if we can gather enough arguments. One was Senator Critterer mentioned a highway project. It was the new 520 bridge, and they insisted that some nice little, exit, is a nice landscaped and designed exit, sort of I don't think it was a clover leaf, but it was something like that. And then they got it, but then the state highway department handed them the bill for it. And then they weren't so happy about it. And it's like, well, if we'd had a public bank, that's where you could have gone for a loan to pay for it. And so it's just, it's just giving these examples that are really important. And that's one side. The other side of the coin is to disabuse them of this idea that it's the politicians that are corrupt, when in fact, it's both sides that are corrupt. Politicians can be corrupt and the business people can be corrupt. And we need to also reveal those experiences. And it's easier to keep track of what our local politicians are doing than it is banks that basically operate in the shadows. And there is a famous problem with a brand new sewage treatment plant in Montgomery County, Alabama, where it just turned, it was a mess. And there were lots of people taken to court and found guilty of malfeasance on the politicians' side, the local politicians and business people. It was just a mess, but it was the Wall Street banks that were running circles around these people by refinancing and doing all sorts of things, bribing each other to not compete for loans for this sewage treatment plant. It was beyond belief, the corruption that was going on. And so we need to highlight those things, not hide them, because it is both sides that have to be held accountable. But one side is easier to hold accountable. The Wall Street banks weren't held accountable in 2008 or 9, so I don't know why we think that they're going to be better able to provide us with the services with our public money.
So there are a couple of questions here. One is whether the state treasurer supports the idea of a public bank, and yes, he does. He's the first state treasurer in the history of Washington State who supports the idea of a public bank. There's another question, which is whether there are states other than North Dakota that have public banks, and the answer is no, not yet. But as you saw on the map, there are several states where there's legislation in place. And I should mention that California passed legislation allowing cities and counties to set up public banks 2 or 3 years ago. And they also have proposed legislation to set up a state public bank. There's a question here about how the public bank provides cash management services to local governments. And I don't know the answer to that question. And it's not clear to me, since we don't know how the legislators are planning to amend the bill this year, we don't know what it's going to provide on that count. Let's see what other questions we have here.
I see one, again, back to Doug, about where will the government get the $50 million when they do not have the revenues to do the job under the law now. This is where it's simple and complicated, because the budget is the money that we get in and the money that we have to add to it to close the gap in the budget. We have a lot of money that's just always there. There's a baseline of money that is always in the bank, whichever bank, public or private. And we already use what's called the local government, what is it? LGIP, investment pool. And the deputy treasurer takes, like, I think it's 10, $15 billion that just is always there, because they're not, what's being taken out from that is never touching into that lower amount of money, base money. And so the deputy treasurer is already investing that money and makes a whopping 2.5% on it, which actually is quite the very conservative, very safe investments. So what I want to take is that idea that there is always this amount of money that is there. And when you have, like for this last year, the state of Washington had $312 billion in transactions. So that's money flowing in and out and through and within. That's a lot of money to keep track of. Some of that money is always there. Is not, and so our own money is sitting and could be used to capitalize and provide the reserves without touching it. You only touch it if you have a disaster in your management or fraud or something like that. And of course, we would want to avoid that being likely to happen by being very strict in how we write the laws that govern the bank, the public bank. But I don't know if that's clear, because my understanding is fuzzy to a certain extent, but there is money that is always in our bank account, and that can be used as the basis for the capital and also the basis for reserves. But then you also have the deposits from the state and the revenues from municipalities and districts and so on like that, which are separate from state revenues. So there really is plenty of money to do this with. And it's not adding new money. It's just using the money that we have and leveraging it is what we're doing, just what the banks do with the deposits that we give them, including our public money deposits. So does that make any sense? I'm not sure I'm being clear at all. No, it doesn't make any sense. Okay. Well, you could unmute yourself if you had any other questions. I mean, something that would,
He's asking very pointed questions.
Well, they're good questions, and they're questions that need to be answered. And a year, well, now it's been quite a few years, Doug Eckstein was the name of the deputy treasurer back around 2010 and 2011. And I interviewed him, and he explained it to me and what he did with this local government investment pool. And so he just explained that the expenses are paid out of this, whatever is over the 10 to 15 billion. And then there's this amount of money that's just there. You never dip into it. And so we need to get some, and we're working on it, to get some experts in that can describe where this money comes from, because it's a little bit of a game. And it's enough of a game that it's hard to believe. Like money is made every time a bank makes a loan. More new money is put into the economy.
So Doug,
I would say,
do you have something to add to this? Go ahead.
The whole thing is very complex, and you need to start from the ground up in terms of not the high 50,000 foot level, because you need to make sure that everything is in sync to make sure it happens, because money is like putting a bunch of wires together to make sure everything flows correctly. I know, Doug, I was the county treasurer for Clark County for 34 years.
You know more
I
than we do.
understand the cash management. I'm still waiting for and I haven't heard even tonight how to put it together, because what it's going to have to require is a lot of money up front that the legislature is going to have to pony up to create a bank. And I think that's a big sell to do. It would be as big as building a bridge on 520 to get something started. The local governments are actually moving that money constantly. Every day you have, and again, you have an option for the local governments to get into it. I think the big 5 counties won't want to be in it, because they could play the market back in New York and earn more interest for the taxpayers of their county. So I think it's going to be a very tough sell. I'm not there as a concept, but when we keep referring to North Dakota, there are many circumstances in North Dakota. They have a fixed rate no matter what, so you can't take advantage of the market if you want to earn more interest. North Dakota is about the size of Pierce County, so and they have a huge oil reserve and not a lot of people. So it's tough to compare it to the state of Washington. But I'm still waiting to. I'm always open to it, but the banks do provide a lot of cash management services. They have to keep up on the technology of the demands all the time. And it's really hard to get, I know even at the county level, to get our IT department to be able to update their systems and put in the money and the technology that's needed to have that. So you have your Wells Fargo's, your key banks, Bank of America and US Bank. Those are your big daddies out there in the state of Washington, and Chase now is getting more involved. And they're the ones that have a lot of technology that can make government a lot more efficient and easier to use. So I'm just, I don't think it's going to be a benefit to some of the larger counties in local government, but if they want to build something into it and ensure that there's always going to be the revenue stream to build the technology to stay up to date with the markets around there, because no matter, even if you're public, you still got to compete with the private sector, and
Sure.
it's just part of the issue in terms of the technology and in terms of all it deals with cash management, because it is a very complex process. So anyway, that's
Yes.
yeah.
Yeah, and that's very helpful to hear.
I agree with you on many things, but I have 2 comments. And one is that they have the ability to keep up with the technology because they have all the money in the world, essentially. And what we want is to have that money benefiting us. And if we had more revenue money without raising in a way that we don't raise taxes, that would help us keep up. The other comment I have is, do you think that the people that, like Doug Eckstein and the other people, aren't intelligent enough, given the same technology, that they could be as competent and maybe not as greedy as the private banks have proven to be over and over and over again? I mean, I think that this idea of private business is always going to be more efficient is false. And also the fact that we don't have more public banks except for North Dakota, is because the private banks have made sure we don't. We can't even, it's been 10 years and it's only this last year that we were taken kind of seriously in the state legislature because the scales are tipped so much on the privatization side. And it's not working. And all you have to do is look outside and see all of the people living on the street. I personally have 2 friends who are unhoused and they have college degrees and they both had medical health problems that basically threw them out of being able to work, literally living on the streets. And I cannot, if private business and the banks were going to take care of that problem, they could have done it by now. And they're not doing it. It's going to be for the government to step up and do it. I would be happy for the private banks to do the things that we should do, but they don't want to, and it's not their mandate. The mandate of the public sector is to take care of the public.
Right. I agree with you. The private sector is set up to make money, and the public sector is to provide services. That's the difference between the public
Yes.
market and the private. I mean,
Yes.
public services and the private.
They have different purposes,
Right.
but they both need to be funded adequately to provide those.
Maybe we should move on to some other questions here.
And I would love to, but I would love to talk more to you about this because I agree with you what we need. Again, I really want to get this right, and I don't want to screw up our system. I want to improve our system, but I do think we have to start with getting the government, which has the mandate to take care of our infrastructure and our people, on board. And I would love to talk with you more about that. If you would like to reach out to me, our email is in the chat box, and I'm quite serious. So I'd appreciate your working with us, at least even from just a critical point of view, pointing out the problems. That's very useful.
Right, and they're reasonable questions that he's asked. Here's a question. What is the entity that would administer a public bank? Is it the government or some other type of organization? It would be like a government department, a separate legal entity managed by a board of directors. The way the bill reads presently, and there's no way of knowing whether this will be the way it ultimately comes out, 5 of the members are 5 of the members of the board are elected by the members of the co-op. And 3 members of the board are appointed by the governor from the public. And then the state treasurer is ex officio a member. And that would be the governing board of the bank. And here's a question. Are one of the Dakotas where the wealthy hide their money? I don't know.
It's South Dakota. South Dakota.
Is it South Dakota?
Yes. I just.
Here's a question. Would there be one public bank per state or many? It depends on what the state legislature decides. The present proposal in Washington State is to have one public bank in Washington State. And I don't see any other questions. Do people want to just speak their questions? If there are some.
Yeah, I have a question, another question. Would a public bank provide consumer banking products like checking accounts and debit cards and that kind of thing for me to provide my banking? Or would it just be like a B2B kind of like support the other banks so that they can make loans?
It depends on what a given state government sets up. The proposal in SB 5188 is a bank that would not allow individuals or businesses to have accounts. It would make, and it wouldn't, and local government units wouldn't exactly have accounts. It would just be a lender to
Gotcha.
them.
Yep, that makes sense. Thank you.
Any other questions?
I just answered another one of Doug's. Hi, Doug.
What was it? Oh, on
Yeah,
in
it
chat.
was what you, yeah, who else we've contacted. We're in the process of reaching out to people to find out all of the groups. There's an enormous number of groups out there. I mean, so many districts, what, 1,500 or something, and then the different tribes and so on. There's just a lot of groups to reach out to.
Well, I was specifically asking for, there's Washington Association of Counties, there's the Washington Association, or the City League of Cities of State of Washington, and there's a Washington State Association of County Treasurers.
Right. And
I
have you
touched
can
base with
answer
all of them?
those. Yeah. The Washington Association of Cities Legislative Affairs Committee thinks it's a good idea. The board hasn't agreed yet. The Washington State Association of Counties actually testified against the bill last year. They were afraid of the risk. I mean, after we've seen what happens when the private sector banks are fiddling around with their money, I'm not sure why they think that would be any less risky. And what was the other group you mentioned? Oh, the state.
The Association of Washington Cities is for it.
Well, but the Legislative Affairs Committee has said they're for it, but the board has not yet.
Oh, okay.
They'll probably want to run them by their finance people. What about the Washington State Association of County Treasurers?
I think
they manage all the money for all the local governments.
Yeah, I think
I don't know the answer to that.
We haven't reached out to each of them. We had a treasurer from Benton County, was it? Who was treasurer, state treasurer.
Oh, Dwayne Davidson?
Yes, Dwayne. Are you
Yeah.
a friend of his?
Dwayne Davidson.
Yeah,
right.
I know him well.
Know him well. Okay. Well, he's one of those that is ideologically opposed to and worked against a public bank. So I don't think that he comes from a place that would be for it. But there are others like Bellingham where they think they would be for it. So it's going to be on a place by place. And some places are very conservative. I lived in the Tri-Cities for 13 years. And it's a very conservative place. And I understand that very well. I actually think of myself as a conservative. I'm trying to conserve money here and save it for the citizens of the state of Washington for our benefit. So, I mean, I look at myself as a conservative. Yes, Anne, did you want to say something? Oh, you're just waving? Okay.
Other questions?
Okay. I might ask people to put comments in the chat. I think Doug's, we can probably remember we need to do our homework better, and we need to reach out to more people, find out what their specific, not ideological, but specific questions are that they need to feel, have understanding about, so that they feel like they can make a competent decision to be for or against a public bank.
I would like to make a comment that, this process has been in play for about 150 years, and I'm saying it's the best process, but it has been I know the required to get 3 bids. We are very active in looking at getting the the lowest, it's competitive in terms of getting the lowest interest for loans. And you also have the state as a, with their pooled local investment program
Yeah.
or loan program.
Yeah, the
That,
local group
yeah,
investment.
the local, that
Cool. Yeah.
that's used also as a comparison because you could go there too. So you have
Who are you? Who are you? When you say we always look for the.
well, I'm talking about the treasurers of the counties, the cities,
Okay.
all the financial people of the different local governments. They all do the same thing and
Sure.
go out there and
Sure.
get the lowest bid when they're looking at getting something. The main problem about funding all of this is that we got to have a legislature willing and the public willing to pay for it.
Okay,
And
yeah,
and
what we're
so it's
saying
going to
is
have
that
to
it
be
doesn't cost though. It's not what you
this
think
it costs one way or the other. And
Yeah, but
either you're not going to have the interest revenue coming in, or you can be paying it to somewhere else. So it because they use that interest to offset the services that they have, so they don't have to require, even though most of the, well, there are some counties that do not take their full 1%, even though the cost of living is at maybe 3 or 4%. So we're always digging a hole in local government. So that's why I was just trying to see how will this help improve, and can they afford at this point in time to pony up the money to do that. I know that Skamania County lives, at least they were when I was treasurer a few years ago, they were living month by month to make sure that they had enough money to just to meet payroll. So they didn't have to worry about investing because they didn't have any. But that's the way that the structure, the finance structure of the state is. We're working on the cheap,
well,
and the public hasn't. Our political leaders have not gone out there to sell the value of the infrastructure needs or other services that they're providing. We state and local governments do a lousy job at that. So unfortunately, we are in the circumstance that we are right now. But if there is money there and they can pool it, then that would be, that'd be fine. But I'm still struggling to see, because the turnover and that money that's sitting there is the state pool is guaranteed a dollar in, dollar out. And that's why it sits there to cover any of the potential downturns in the market. And so that money is there because, again, no matter if you're I assume, and that's why I was asking in this bill, if you are a public bank, you're using your excess proceeds to go out there on the market to try to raise more, or to get more interest. But if it's just a lending where you're just getting loans out, I mean, just serve and to get it started, they have the public trust funds and other types of revenue sources for local governments to fund roads and things like that. It's just a little bit all the time, and so it takes forever to get things done, and they never can catch up.
Yeah,
because things deteriorate.
So I think that what I hear you saying is that we always seem to be behind. And what I'm trying to say, and Stoney and I and others, and we need to bring some bigger guns in that know more than what we do. We need to structure things differently so that there is more money. I think we share an interest. In fact, I would say I know we share an interest in doing what is best for our state and our country. And so I think that the idea that because the banks have been operating for so long, actually it's just mainly the last century, that's what it is. And I think that there is room for a public sector bank to handle public sector revenues. And that would be more cost efficient, and it wouldn't make a maximum return on the dollar, But what is done is an improvement in the infrastructure. What is done is getting broadband to those counties that don't have it yet because there isn't enough money. It is where the money is applied, not just maximizing the profits on it. And maximizing those profits come at a great risk. And then how well off are the rest of us when it's the public money that is used to save the banks so that they don't have to go bankrupt? It's okay for us to go bankrupt, but not the big banks. That I just think that's not right. So, but I do think that we have the same purpose in mind. It's just that, you know, General Motors said, well, what's good for General Motors is good for the country. Well, when that person said it, I think that may have been true. But what's good for the big banks right now is not good for our country, not anywhere close.
Well, I think generally, I mean, yeah, there might be money left around for different reasons, but everything's been sort of allocated for a purpose, and so those things are going to get used eventually. If we stop collecting any money now, everything would be used up, and there wouldn't be anything there. So
Actually, if we paid off all of our debts, that's when we would have no money.
But the state has a balanced budget. And the local governments have balanced budgets, so they don't have. You go out for bonds for school districts or building water works or whatever the project is, and you obligate either revenue bonds or you obligate general obligation bonds, which is through property taxes, or you do that. But it's very limited in terms of what you can spend. I know in Clark County, there's never been a voter approved bond to build any public infrastructure, whether it's a jail, courthouse, or whatever. It's always had to be some other revenue source to do it. People just don't want to be adding an additional tax to what they feel that they already have paid. And so governments struggle all along because they never really have enough to do everything, and they have to go out and borrow money to make build that building because they just run out of room.
I think I hear what you're saying, and I agree with you. I just disagree on we should be borrowing from ourselves and not borrowing from the private sector.
Well, that's where the money is right now. If you had a public bank and you had it, then yeah.
$300 billion in money flows through the state of Washington.
It flows. It doesn't stay.
But it doesn't all flow. That's not all going in and not all going out.
But it's still somebody else's money. It's still somebody else's money.
The revenues are not someone else's money. The revenues are the state government's money.
I detect a conversation.
We need to do this offline. I'm surprised anyone else is still listening.
Going on between two people here.
Right.
And do others have questions? Hearing none.
Well, who's supposed to close the meeting? Is this Teresa?
I can, or Jamie.
Okay.
I'll go ahead. I'll say thank you very much for as the civics education chairperson for the Clark County League of Women Voters. I want to thank you for doing this presentation. I want to thank the library for making it possible. And I know I learned some stuff tonight, and I just want to thank you all for coming. So at that point, Jamie can sign us all out of here.